Thank you for joining us here on the webinar, Road Pricing Projects, Understanding Impacts to More People. I'm Heather Wills, and I'm going to start us out this morning. And here joining me is Nicole McDermott and Rebecca Steiner. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so you can write them in the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And the presentation is available in the handouts box on your GoToWebinar as well. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about the Oregon Toll Program, just to orient everyone here to the area that we're talking about. And then we're really going to get into the topic that we're here to discuss, which is the equity framework, as well as our approach to developing an equity and mobility advisory committee and the equity framework communities analysis approach, which is really how we did the analysis to understand the impacts to more people. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm Heather Wills. I'm a vice president here at WSP. I'm the project manager for the projects that we have under the Oregon Toll Program. And joining me is Nicole McDermott, and she's a public involvement specialist as well as a supervising planner, and she is leading one of the projects, which is the I-205 toll project. And also with me is Rebecca Steiner. She's an environmental planner, and she is our crack analyst that developed the methodology for how we're doing the impact analysis for more people on the project in the project area. Next slide, please. So the Oregon toll projects are located in Oregon. It's right on the border of Oregon and Washington. The project area includes 4 counties: Clackamas, Multnomah, Washington, and Marion. And the project area that we're working in is about 2.2 million people. There's 2 projects, as I said. One is a toll project on the I-205 corridor, which has 2 toll points. And the revenue generated from that project would be used to fund some improvement projects. And then the other project is the Regional Mobility Pricing Project, which is the darker blue that you see on the map there. And that is congestion pricing project, where we're talking about pricing existing capacity without necessarily adding additional capacity. Discussions are still ongoing around where the revenue would be spent for that project, but it is a large area that would be potentially priced in the future. This is what we're studying right now. Next slide, please. So WSP was hired by the Oregon Department of Transportation to lead the development of the National Environmental Policy Act process. So for those that are not in the US that are joining us, that is a federal law that really holds projects accountable for the decisions that they're making. And it includes transportation analysis, environmental analysis, a lot of public and stakeholder engagement, and committee formation and facilitation, which Nicole will talk a little bit about in her portion of the presentation. The WSP team has about 17 sub-consultants on it, and 8 of those are DBEs, or disadvantaged business enterprises, which are small businesses owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. It's a pretty high percentage that we're trying to meet in order to provide those opportunities. The challenge that we were asked to help address was really to provide a meaningful analysis using a lot of outreach tools and committees and whatever creative solutions we could come up with to really reach and understand what impacts might occur to communities that have been historically and are currently underrepresented in decision-making processes. And because they've been historically underrepresented, they're currently underserved by the transportation system. So this approach was to help provide Oregon Department of Transportation, or ODOT for short, some tools to address that challenge. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole to talk a little bit more about the topic here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heather. So One challenge that the Portland metro area is facing, along with many other places throughout the United States, is rising costs leading to inequities. So here, transportation is the second largest expense for families after housing. So as seen on the chart on the screen, traffic on the highways in the Portland area has returned to pre-pandemic volumes. So this creates additional expenses for those that are pushed out to the edges by rising housing costs, and on the edges of the city, there are fewer transportation options, just further leading to those inequities. So next slide, please. Part of the solution to those challenges of rising inequities is to center equity in the toll program. So in this context, equity means reducing barriers and creating better solutions and benefits for historically excluded and underserved communities. The Oregon Department of Transportation and the Oregon Transportation Commission have recognized that past land use and transportation investments in the Portland metro area, including their highway investments, have resulted in negative cultural, health, economic, and relational impacts to local communities, especially for those historically and excluded groups, as Heather mentioned. So in order to do things differently, equity is guiding the toll program work. With community outreach that was conducted over the past several years as this project has been underway, some consistent themes have emerged as key considerations to advance equity. Those are improving the public transportation system, minimizing impacts to local neighborhoods, minimizing impacts to experiencing low incomes or people who are underserved, and including and engaging community voices in the process. So next slide, please. ODOT worked with equity experts, including an equity and mobility advisory committee that I will discuss in a moment, to develop an equity framework and to really guide the toll program and ensure that tolling on I-205 and I-5 in the Portland area will lead to equitable outcomes. So the equity framework includes a multi-step process for decision making. There's a series of questions at each step to advance equity. And these steps really have guided the project team as they developed outreach strategies and prepared the documentation for the National Environmental Policy Act compliance. So next slide, please. Another way that the Oregon Department of Transportation is doing things differently with the toll program was with the development of an Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee. So, and this committee has a direct line of communication to the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is the toll rate setting authority here in Oregon. This committee is a group of individuals with professional or lived experience in equity and mobility that will provide those recommendations to the Oregon Transportation Commission and the Oregon Department of Transportation on how implementation of the toll program can include benefits for populations that have been historically and are currently underrepresented or underserved by those transportation projects. So it's important to note here that the committee is focused on providing benefits to underserved communities, not just to addressing the impacts of the toll program. The EMAC, as they're called for short, had a lot of input into the performance measures that were also developed for the I-205 toll project, which has really guided the technical analysis that Rebecca will discuss in a few moments. Next slide, please. So the last item I want to touch on is just our community engagement approach, which has continued, has been and continues to be a very inclusive and extensive public and stakeholder engagement effort. So even in the time of COVID, when in-person engagement was very limited, there has been a lot of outreach to local communities through the advisory committees, as mentioned with EMAC, other committees, talking to our regional partners on a regular basis. But one really unique aspect of this outreach was working with community engagement liaisons. So they conduct direct outreach in their communities in native languages. And the image on the screen is a community liaison-led discussion group from last fall. So all of this outreach has helped shape the environmental analysis and how we assess impacts to different community groups. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to discuss the technical analysis that went into the preparation of technical reports, which are a required element of the environmental documentation under NEPA. So Rebecca, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole and Heather. So I'll discuss some more of the technical analysis that was used for the project and the NEPA documentation. And just for some context, a presidential executive order directs federal agencies to identify and address the disproportionately high and adverse impacts of their actions on minority and low-income populations to the greatest extent possible. And the toll program goes beyond analyzing impacts just to low-income and minority populations by expanding its analysis to include other historically excluded and underserved groups, as shown on the screen. So based on the equity framework discussed before by Nicole, the technical team identified what we called equity framework communities, or EFCs for short. They included people experiencing low income or economic disadvantage, minorities, people experiencing a disability, seniors, children, people with limited English proficiency, and households with no vehicle access. In addition, EMAC was able to identify community resources that were important to underserved and historically excluded populations, and they included things like schools, libraries, parks, healthcare facilities, and religious organizations. The mapping team was then able to create detailed maps for where those social resources were located. So for the analysis, we wanted to determine whether these equity framework communities would experience a change in accessibility or a change in travel time to those important social resources. And this goal shaped our accessibility analysis and travel time analysis as shown on the screen. So the accessibility analysis determined how many jobs, community places, and medical facilities could be reached within a 20 or 30-minute drive or a 30 or 45-minute transit trip for existing conditions, a future 2045 alternative with tolling, and a future 24 alternative without tolling. And then the travel time analysis was used to determine the potential travel time impacts to equity framework communities by using what we called representative scenarios. So the analysis required the team to divide the area of interest into what are called transportation analysis zones, or TAZs, which come from the regional traffic model. And this map to the right shows the project area divided up by those TAZs. So each TAZ contains a variety of information, such as existing land use characteristics, street connectivity, parking and transit fare costs, planned projects, and household and employment assumptions. So first, the technical team defined where a high concentration of equity framework communities lived, which we called home TAZs. This was based on demographic data from the US Census Bureau and on a threshold. So if a TAZ had a higher proportion of one or more equity framework communities than the county it was located in, it was considered an equity framework home TAZ. So for example, TAZ 847, which is highlighted in that red box on the map, that's located in Canby, and it has a higher percentage of people with a disability and people who identify as an ethnic minority than Clackamas County. So it was labeled as an equity framework home TAZ as a result. Then the technical team found activity TAZs, which were TAZs with a high concentration of destinations people would travel to. These were things like social resources that EMAC identified earlier, so the schools, parks, jobs, and medical facilities. And so, for example, TAZ 729, which is located in downtown Oregon City, reflected a city core with a number of amenities such as retail locations, grocery stores, restaurants, job centers, and religious organizations. In addition, downtown Oregon City also has a state unemployment office, the Oregon City Public Library, the Clackamas County Public Health Building, and Clackamas County Mental Health Building. And then lastly, fall 2020 public engagement activities identified Oregon City as an area of potential concern for rerouting. And rerouting is when drivers choose not to drive on the highway and instead drive on local streets. And so the team especially wanted to consider this area for the analysis because of that potential concern. So the accessibility analysis helped determine the percent difference in the number of community places, jobs, and medical facilities accessible for households. And so based on the analysis, we found that the alternative with tolling would result in the same or greater accessibility to social resources for households in the area of interest when compared to the alternative without tolling. And so the analysis team did not see any decrease in accessibility. EFCs, in addition, would generally experience the same or greater accessibility than the general population. So for example, we can take a look at the results for the accessibility to low-wage jobs, which included jobs paying less than $40,000 per year. The equity framework communities would experience about a 3% increase to low-wage jobs within a 30-minute drive. And this is an increase of about 3,800 jobs being accessible within a 30-minute drive. The area of interest as a whole would experience about a 1.7% increase in the number of low-wage jobs accessible within a 30-minute drive, and that's about 2,500 jobs. So the technical team then created 16 representative scenarios to estimate potential travel time impacts to equity framework communities and the general population. 12 of the representative scenarios were representative of the equity framework communities and had a starting point in one of the equity framework home TAZs. 4 of the representative scenarios were representative of non-equity framework communities, and their starting point was in a TAZ not labeled as an equity framework home TAZ. And so there's an example on the screen. This is actually the first representative scenario that we looked at. But each scenario includes a general description of where a sample traveler lives. So that would be the trip start point. They also included a brief sample trip description, such as the purpose of the trip, the time of day, and then the mode. And then they also included a sample trip destination or a trip endpoint. We also wanted to preface that these 16 representative scenarios could not possibly incorporate every possible trip within the region, but were used to evaluate a representative sample of trips within the area of interest. And so we tried to pick a variety of routes that would represent a number of different trips and that covered the entire area of interest. So some representative scenarios had a route that would go through the segment of I-205 proposed for tolling, and that was called the toll path in this analysis. And others also included a route that would not go through that segment, and that was the toll-free path. And we wanted to look at the toll-free path to evaluate how travel times would be impacted on parallel routes, and that could be potentially subjected to rerouting. And then lastly, in addition, 3 scenarios were evaluated for transit travel times based on existing fixed routes for the transit trip. And we assumed that the transit trips would use the same route in the future. So for the results of the travel time analysis, none of the representative scenarios would result in longer travel times for routes using the toll path under the alternative with tolling as compared with that alternative without tolling. And none of the representative scenarios using transit would experience a longer travel time under the alternative with tolling. However, 3 of the scenarios resulted in longer travel times on the toll-free path, which could indicate rerouting and a potential impact. And then, so the transportation technical team evaluates rerouting in more detail and also proposes mitigation measures to avoid those impacts. So in general, the analysis showed that the trips using the I-205 corridor had shorter travel times with tolling compared to the alternative without tolling, which could provide benefits to those using the corridor. And so with that, I will pass it back to Nicole to wrap things up. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So as we've touched on, really through this analysis and through our engagement, we've realized that meaningful and continuous engagement of historically and currently underrepresented and underserved communities can generate change in the way a project is planned and executed. As Rebecca mentioned in her technical analysis, the way that analysis was done and really came from a lot of outreach from our equity committee and equity framework communities as well. So then developing an equity framework really keeps the project team accountable, and it centers equity at each step of the process. And then again, as Rebecca touched on in that analysis, there's qualitative and quantitative data that can be used to evaluate those impacts to historically and currently underrepresented and underserved communities, which will lead to a better understanding of those potential impacts and mitigation. Some things you cannot learn just from the quantitative data, being out, talking to people, and understanding that qualitative aspect really goes a long way to understanding those potential impacts and what would be the mitigation to those for those communities that would really mitigate that impact. And then this is all projections and based on models. So, long-term monitoring and continued engagement with communities, including those equity framework communities, is really what is needed to ensure that a project leads to those equitable outcomes that we are all hoping for and planning for. So with that, well, I appreciate everyone's time and you all for being here today, and we will turn it over to Sharon to lead the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, Nicole, and Rebecca for a fantastic presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of this presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. So we received some questions before the presentation. I will start with the first one. This is from the UK. Has there been any special tariff schemes designed for the lower income population using such upgraded roads? And if so, if you can please give example.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I'll start on this one. And the Oregon legislature actually passed a law that requires the Oregon Department of Transportation to look at methods for income-based tolls. So we are currently preparing, the Oregon Department of Transportation with WSP's assistance is currently preparing a low-income toll report where we are looking at the impacts and benefits to low-income populations and how different credits or potential exemptions could offset any potential impact. So that is in process, and with that, and then also with the work that we've done with the Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee, there's been a lot of research into what other places have done to offset impacts to low-income populations, and typically it is credit or exemption programs. And one of the things we've found in our research that is a real barrier is it's actually people signing up. So even though those project or programs exist, the people who sign up for them, there's a really low percentage of the population that actually signs up for them. So that's a barrier that we're trying to overcome in our work and in implementation. Heather, Rebecca, anything to add to that? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question from Finland. Do you have any insights on congestion charges? And there are some discussions in Europe more and more to use congestion charges as a tool for sustainability. Your thoughts on this, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Heather, I'll pass that one over to you.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so here we would define congestion pricing or congestion pricing as charging a higher price during more congested periods. So the Oregon Toll Program right now, all of their projects assume that there would be a schedule, so you would know how much it would cost. So it's not dynamic. It wouldn't like change by the minute based on congestion, but there would be a schedule, and it would cost a lot more, not a lot more, it would cost more to drive during the peak periods when it's more congested than it would in the lower congested times of day.
Thank you. Another question here is, did the ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, the project team identify individual to participate on the EMAC committee? Again, EMAC is the Equity, Mobility and Advisory Committee. I hope I'm mentioning it correctly.
You are. Yes, so that was a pretty extensive process. So the project team first identified specific organizations and groups they wanted representation from, and reached out to those groups to obtain individuals that would could and would participate on the EMAC. And then there was also a broad application process in order to get community at-large members. So I was not involved in the project when that group actually was formed. So Heather, do you have any other details to kind of add to that?
No, I mean, you got it. There was an application process for the remaining 4 positions that were the at-large positions. But yeah, we recruited very specific interests because we wanted to make sure that we had the interests represented that we knew needed to be represented, and we weren't confident that we would get that through just an at-large process if we did it for all the positions. So.
Thank you. How did the audit encourage individuals from historically excluded populations to participate on the project, and especially when there are potential barriers to participations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. ODOT has been working really hard to kind of develop some, contracting, I think, protocols, if you might call it that, and how to provide stipends for individuals to participate on committees and within discussion groups and things like that. Because one barrier we see a lot of times to participation in advisory committees or even attending meetings and being part of the process is the cost. So you might have to take time out of your day, or you might not have childcare options, those types of things. So ODOT's been looking, really trying to reduce those barriers and eliminate at least one, being the cost, by being able to pay people for their time and participation in those efforts. Heather, Rebecca, anything else there?
Fantastic, thank you. So we don't have additional questions. So it looks like we're at the end of our webinar session, and I would like to thank again Heather, Rebecca, and Nicole for a fantastic presentation, really interesting projects. And the contact details for reach out to them is on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And we hope to see you in future webinars. So thank you.